Biopolitics series. This is a series of live web-based interviews about the social meanings and implications of human genetic and reproductive technologies. And we began this series with the aim of helping us think more strategically about how to bring our shared concerns about the emerging biopolitics to a broader public, and how to get our ideas about addressing these concerns into the public sphere and onto the policy agenda. And so the Talking Biopolitics series is a set of conversations among people who have thought about these issues and want to sort of think about how to extend that understanding to larger circles of people. The topics that Harriet and Lisa will be talking about today and that your questions will be focused on, others related to human genetic and reproductive technologies and practices, all of these are topics that will be addressed this summer at the 3rd Tarrytown Meeting, which is a working meeting bringing together scholars and advocates working toward a biopolitics that's based in a set of public interest values: social justice, human rights, the common good, democratic governance, and ecological integrity. For those of you who don't know about the Tarrytown Meetings, you can find out more on the CGS website, and we'll send you a link in the follow-up email that we send you as well. Now, some of the people who are part of this call have been at previous Tarrytown Meetings in 2010 or 2011, or at other Center for Genetics and Society events, and others of you heard about this event today, this webinar, from colleagues. And we welcome you all. We're very glad that you're here. In recent Talking Biopolitics events, we have talked with Dorothy Roberts, legal scholar and reproductive justice and racial justice advocate, and author of an important book, recent book, Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. And we've talked also recently with Bill McKibben, the climate change campaigner and author of the book Enough: Staying Human in an Engineered Age. We have recorded those conversations and are recording this one, and those recorded versions of the conversation will be available, so we'll send you that information also in a link. And we would welcome your feedback about this event today and the whole Talking Biopolitics series, and are looking forward to answering your questions later on in this hour. So with that, let me introduce Lisa Ikemoto, who will be interviewing Harriet today. Lisa teaches bioethics, healthcare law, public health law, reproductive rights, law and policy, and marital property at the UC Davis School of Law. She also works with several public interest organizations, especially those focused on reproductive justice issues and on biopolitical issues as well. Her research areas include reproductive and genetic technology uses, healthcare disparities, and public health law. And she focuses on the ways that race and gender mediate access to and impacts of biomedical technology use in healthcare. She's done some important recent work on reproductive tourism, on the ways in which human gamete use links the fertility and biotech industries, and the privatizing effects of informed consent. And many of those are issues that I know we'll touch on today in the Talking Biopolitics conversation that we'll now begin. Okay, Lisa.
Thank you, Marcy. And I want to start by welcoming everybody who's online to this conversation. I want to emphasize that I see my role as starting the conversation with our guest, Harriet Washington, and I encourage everyone to send in questions on the Q&A function on the website. It's my great pleasure to introduce Harriet Washington. Harriet has been a fellow in medical ethics at the Harvard Medical School. She's been a senior research scholar at the National Center for Bioethics at Tuskegee University, a fellow at the Harvard School of Public Health, and a recipient of the John S. Knight Fellowship at Stanford University. And from what I've learned of Harriet, she is a polymath, has many talents, but today she's here in her role as an activist science writer, one who's worked inside the biomedical enterprise in different capacities, and yet offers a strong critical perspective. Harriet has recently published a book, Deadly Monopolies, which examines the many ways in which commercialization has pervaded biomedical science and in the process has realigned the motives and interests of the industry and configured what she calls a medical industrial complex. So welcome, Harriet.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm very pleased to talk to you about my work.
I want to start by noting that Deadly Monopolies is huge in scope. It's wide-ranging at a couple of different levels. You take on privatization, no small issue. And then while you center the role of the U.S., you do so in a global context. So I want to start by asking you to kind of boil it down for us to start the conversation and identify your key themes for us. Maybe more than one, but less than 10?
I will certainly try, and you're right, that's a lot of boiling. The focus of the book is on a transformation of American medical research that I think has gone largely unnoticed by the general public, but it's affected them profoundly. So what I attempted to do was to talk about some of the major ways in which this change of focus from research driven by the passions of researchers in the context of a university that was dedicated to the common weal to a corporate model, which is focused, of course, on profits. Profits aren't a dirty word in capitalist society, but I think that, and I'm not alone in thinking this, healthcare is different. And the fact that now we have a corporate, shall we say, I don't know, a corporate zeitgeist that's now taken over medicine is really, significant. So I look at the way it's affected us in terms of the price of drugs, a perennial complaint, but it's just changed astronomically lately. And of course, the price of drugs and the loss of employment with our recent economic turnaround has paired to create disasters throughout the middle class. We're no longer talking about people who are poor and marginalized traditionally. We're talking about the middle class. I also extend that to the third world, and I try to show how the same forces that drive barriers to health care for the middle class in this country, a relatively affluent country, are affecting the developing world, of course, in a much more profound way. They're very difficult and sparse access to health care, and needed drugs has now dried up tremendously, and it's become almost a total lack of access, a total vacuum. I also talk about privatization in genetic research particularly. I use that as a focus point, but it actually applies to all research. Privatization has come up with it's created medical policies that operate against the health of Americans. So when you have companies who decide that they will pursue a particular drug and will not pursue another drug based on their foreseeable profits rather than the need for that drug, we've got a problem. And when you have people who have illnesses that are predicated by genes and other factors that are literally patented and owned by corporations, they have an undue amount of control over the research that's done, over the drugs that are promulgated for those diseases and illnesses, and of course, what they can charge. So we have a society where women who are at risk for breast cancer, a higher than normal risk for breast cancer, have to pay $4,000 enough to quantify that risk. That has to do with this change. I also talk about the there's no polite way to say this, but I also talk about the various informed consent variations that result in consent that's not informed and often is not really consent because people don't have a chance to say no. So like the impression, the collection of tissues from people about to undergo surgery, the collection of tissues from the dead, the collection of tissues under the guise of altruism that are then bought and sold without the knowledge of people. All these things are driven by this, corporate animus. And all these things, pertain to this sea change in medical research to a profit-making entity. I could go on. There's much more, but that gives you some idea of the scope that you talked about, which is indeed broad.
I'm going to ask you to elaborate a little bit on that. I think one of the things that your wide scope enables you to do is show how the different themes are interlaced. And one of the things I really like about the way you do that is you use individual stories of people who are patients and people who are researchers to show how they've been impacted by the corporatization of biomedicine. So could you maybe describe one of those stories for people who haven't read the book yet, one or two of the stories, and sort of use that to elaborate upon your themes?
Sure. I think that one story that personally I found extremely poignant, moving, and ultimately tragic incorporates a lot of these things. The story of and Debbie Greenberg. The Greenberg fortunately married and had children only then to discover that they both carried the allele for Canavan's disease, and their first child was born with Canavan's disease. And when the second child was also born with Canavan's disease, it's a disease, a really sad disease. It affects young children. It disrupts formation of the myelin sheath, so neurologically the children never develop. It's a constant downward spiral, and many children die before reaching their teens. And by the time they die, they're completely immobile, they're paralyzed. It's a horrible tragedy for the entire family. And at the time that the Greenbergs discovered that they carry this gene, this trait, there was no way to test for it, and there was certainly no cure or treatment. So they were mobilized to find a way to cure this. And they decided to enlist the help of a researcher named Dr. Ruben Madelon. They knew that the research would never save their children because it would take too long. But they enlisted many, many people. They mobilized the community. Although Canavan's affects every ethnic group, it's been most heavily studied in Ashkenazi Jews. It was primarily Ashkenazi Jews who banded together as a group of advocates for their children. And they supplied Dr. Madelon with everything requested in terms of tissues and medical histories and blood samples. And ultimately, he was able to develop a test for it, a screening test, to help people to find out whether they were going to be, it's kind of parallel to Tay-Sachs, to find out whether or not if they had children, the children could be affected. Also, he developed a test to find out whether a developing fetus was affected, so they would have the option of pregnancy termination. So this was wonderful, but it wasn't enough because the test was not good enough to save every child, to determine every child. So Dr. Madelon, in concert with this group of advocates, these families who had bounded together, many of these families, they gave them many tissue samples, lots of material, and ultimately he was able to discover the gene for Canavan. Well, this is a blessing because now a practically foolproof test could be developed, and it was, and everyone celebrated. It was a wonderful thing. And after a year or two, ACOG, the gynecologist organization in the U.S., decided that this gene was such a wonderful accomplishment that it mandated that people at risk should be given this test. That was a wonderful development because it meant that all the families who could possibly be at risk had to be tested, and pediatricians and gynecologists would know to test them. This is a wonderful development, except that right after the use of the gene was mandated by the obstetricians organization, Dr. Madelon, University of Miami, came forward to say that they had a patent on the gene, not a new patent. They'd taken the patent out a year ago without telling the people who had made it possible, who had contributed their tissues. And using that patent on the gene, which was now going to be in high demand, they began to levy a price for its use. They began charging people. So the families were devastated. This was the exact opposite of what they wanted. They wanted a gene to be identified and a test to be made so that people could unstintingly take advantage of it. Now its control, its price is going to be controlled by a company, by a corporation with profit as its end. They fought it, but as almost always happens in these cases, when individuals or even groups of affected individuals fight a university researcher's patent, they always lose. Whether they're fighting a university or they're fighting, which is more common now, a corporation, they tend to lose. And so this one story incorporates so many elements I saw over and over again. What I saw was individuals seeking out information, development of research in order not only to help themselves, but in order to help other affected people or future affected people with altruistic aims, only to have those altruistic aims sabotaged by a corporation whose focus was very different, whose focus was on the profitability of the development. So I think their case is, very poignant for me because personally I was affected by their generosity and being able to do all this work for a test that would never help their own children. And in the end, I just, really shared their sense of tragedy, that after all their pain and their contributions and generosity and efforts, what emerged was not at all what they had hoped would emerge from, medical science. They felt that they had been let down, and so do I.
I found that story very compelling. I want to turn to what you identify as kind of the point at which biomedicine changed. You described the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 as sort of a legal, ethical, and cultural Rubicon, if you will. You hark back to the pre-Bayh-Dole days, and you describe academic research in those days as more altruistic, collaborative, and research results as more accurate and reliable, less subject to bias. And I want to push you a little bit on that. You yourself have documented in your previous award-winning book, Medical Apartheid, that medical research has a long history of bias and of imposing the greatest risks on the institutionalized and those others who are also politically marginalized and vulnerable. And you have documented how we have long used in the United States consequentialist rationales for doing this. So I guess my question is, what change did Bayh-Dole make that has made things worse than it was before?
Certainly, Lisa, you make a very good point, which is the halcyon days before Bayh-Dole were not perfect. However, they were very different in that, one thing that has not changed at all, has not been changed by Bayh-Dole, is that the people in the developing world, that racially and ethnically marginalized people in this country, have never been a priority of medical research. They've often been marginalized, I don't want to say usually mistreated, but much more often mistreated, and that has not changed, you're right. However, things have become much worse. They have become much worse for people who don't constitute those, traditionally abused minorities. And remember, I mentioned the middle class, for example. We're talking now about people who've been considered the target group, the people who were helped by medical research. Now they're no longer being helped, and in that way, things have worsened. So there's also the fact that even though we had utilitarian consequentialist schemes are always abusive, I think, of minority groups because the tyranny of the majority can just be overwhelming when it comes to, in medical context as well as political context. But now we're not talking about only marginalized groups. Now we're talking about mainstream people in the mainstream, not having their illnesses addressed by research, but rather being sold endless permutations of a drug for erectile dysfunction, that sort of thing. Also, some of the also have to make a distinction between government research and corporate research. Obviously, as anybody who read Medical Apartheid knows, I'm not an unstinting fan of government research. It's done some horrible things, horrible omissions. They still persist in doing that. And yet, to take a consequentialist, a utilitarian view, for the majority of people, the research conducted by the government tends to be more responsive to actual medical needs and tends to be conducted much more cheaply. And there are many reasons why that's important. We can talk about those later. But much more cheaply, much more effectively. And that's simply not the case with research that is conducted for profit. I'm thinking, too, of the ways, one thing that really troubles me is that we already had an ethically troubled medical system before 1980. That's quite clear. But it has become worse in many ways. And it has become worse in one sense fed by this purchase bias. You look at things like the FDA, which now derives a lot of its funds for testing new medications from the makers of those medications. And I don't think it's really any accident that we see concomitantly an increase in disastrous medicines being approved, and then amid many reports of harms and abuses being withdrawn from the market after handsome profits are made, and also the complaints of people who work at the FDA themselves, who've been there for a long time, complaining that their culture has changed and they're now being urged to approve drugs they would never have approved 10 or 15 years ago. So I think unfortunately, if history teaches anything, it's that things can always get worse. It's the case in which that's happened, abetted by the laws of 1980.
Thank you. I have lots more questions myself, but I want to encourage anybody who's online to send in your own questions. You can join the conversation by using the Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen and send it to Marcy Darnowski on the drop-down question, and we'll try to get those questions to Harriet, have you participate more directly in the conversation. Harriet, I think part of what you did in the book was illustrate for me how the 1980s felt in many ways like a slap in the face. You think about what happened in the 1970s. Finally, the New York Times breaks the Tuskegee syphilis study and makes it into a national story, and Congress responds and finally prioritizes protecting human subjects participating in research for the good of everyone else. We get the National Research Act. And at the same time, in the sort of more standard healthcare settings, patient advocates, including women's health advocates, do a lot to push the courts to sort of fully recognize patient autonomy and develop the doctrine of informed consent. And then along in the 1980s, along comes sort of the neoliberal capture of intellectual property law. And you sort of detail the way that's affected the pharmaceutical industry. And you had talked about, you just mentioned the phenomena of purchase bias in that. I wonder if you want to elaborate with a couple of other ways in which the change in the 1980s affected the way that the pharmaceutical industry has operated and affected us.
I think one important way, one of the many important ways it has affected us, is the pharmaceutical industry successfully, the line between the pharmaceutical industry, the profit-making entity, and universities as institutions mounted in the public interest, that line was effaced. It was blurred into unrecognizability to the point where today, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the medical departments of some universities more closely resemble departments of corporations than they do independent entities. As a matter of fact, I recall that at one point, Harvard Medical School, the dermatology division had undertaken a contract with Shiseido that was pretty far-reaching, in which Shiseido actually, in effect, bought a great deal of the research emanating from the department over a 10-year period. So that sort of thing, I think that's really one really significant way in which the law affected this blurring of the lines between universities and corporations, because the danger there is then you have medical researchers, the very people who I praised in the past as having been driven by motivations other than money. You have medical researchers whose loyalties we can't quite be sure of. I mean, do they view themselves as part of a profit-making machine, as employees of a corporation in essence, or do they view themselves as people devoted, to the health of mankind, or both? I suppose it's possible one can be both, but I also think that most people and patients like myself would like to know with whom you're dealing, especially when you're talking about a research protocol where you already have a sort of a fading, a blurring of this line between the scientist as a researcher and the physician.
You mentioned a major theme in your book, I think, is the change in the relationship between the university and the commercial enterprise in science. And I know, as one who works at a research university, that technology transfer is celebrated in the academic setting. And one of the changes that many have commented on recently has been sort of the shift, many say the reallocation of research resources from sort of basic science to translational science or research. And do you see that as sort of a follow-up to Bayh-Dole, or sort of an offspring of Bayh-Dole? How does that fit into your analysis?
I think it is. I think that it does indeed reflect this corporate mentality, this results-oriented mentality, which is really more than results-oriented. It's actually profit-oriented. The question becomes often not so much whether one's new invention or discovery results in, say, a molecule that can treat a disease, but is it going to result in something that is patentable? Those are not the same thing. Something can be patentable and can be merchandised and not really have a very important effect on health. If you're focused on a patentable molecule, then frankly you will settle for, erectile dysfunction drug number 19. But if your focus is not that, if your focus is on alleviating human health, then you've set the bar a bit higher. You'll be a bit more discriminating. Also, I'm a little, I'll admit that part of this is aesthetic, but I think part of it is moral too. I'm just a little concerned about a focus on profit by researchers because it seems to overlook the fact that, as I think I point out in the book, many important medical discoveries come about through happy accidents. Medical research, even though it attracts people who are very brilliant and excellent at designing research, very often it's not completely linear, not as linear as you would think. And there are many, many happy accidents. I think about Alexander Fleming, who discovered, penicillin. Why? Because he neglected to disinfect the petri dish, and bacteria grew on it. Aspartame, the artificial sweetener, discovered by accident. A chemist was looking for, I think, something quite different. He was looking for an ulcer medication, and he licked his fingers, a no-no in the lab, of course, and they tasted sweet. So you have all these events where medications were devised because people were looking for something else, and I wonder how much of that can remain if one is focused in a very linear way on, a particular problem having to do with a very big financial payoff.
I want to turn to the way you structured the book. You sort of lead the analysis to two very big last two chapters, and you frame the discussion where you focus on the sort of effects of all these phenomena on the developing world. You use the frames of biocolonialism, biopiracy. You talk about and critique the outsourcing of human subject research, the shifting of risk through phase 3 clinical trials being done abroad in the developing world. And so I guess I wanted to ask you sort of why that emphasis?
It's very interesting because people sometimes ask me whether this book was an outgrowth of medical apartheid, in which I critiqued the use of African Americans in U.S. medical research, and it wasn't. But actually, I think in those last two chapters perhaps it was, because I see happening in the developing world the same thing that happened here in the United States and other Western countries when it came to singling out groups of people, ethnically divergent groups of people, in this country it was racial groups, as the recipients of the sort of research that one didn't want to conduct on people of one's own class. People were considered, we can consign them to the more risky research. And that's exactly what's happening in the developing world. It's become the laboratory of the West, in my opinion, and there has been a consistent trend toward, I think, diminution of standards when it comes to research protecting them. We're exporting more and more research to the developing world. The New England Journal of Medicine pointed out that it's now 1 in 3 studies done by corporations. More and more research. At the same time, the Declaration of Helsinki underwent some changes that were described as, modernizations, but actually resulted in a lower standard of care. To give just one example, it used to stipulate that if one's conducting research with people for a disease, then one had to provide to the control group the standard of care for that disease, so that nobody who was sick or at risk of being sick would actually go without treatment. But now it reads that you have to provide the standard of care in that country for the research. In many of these countries, the standard of care is nothing. So that's a reduction in the standards of protection for them. At the same time, we actually make a great deal of money by exporting our research to the developing world because better quality research can be conducted much more cheaply and much more quickly. And for corporations seeking a patent and FDA approval in a timely manner, time is money. So even though many people frame the question of how much aid we should give, medical aid we should give to people in the developing world, whether or not we should make medications available to them at much reduced prices, whether or not we should suspend the respecting of patents in order to give them cheaper medications, it's also often framed in terms of What should we do for these people? They're supplicants. They need our help. How much help do we want to give them? How much help can we afford to give them? I think that's the wrong way to frame it. Personally, I look at the situation as us owing them a great debt because they have supplied not only their people for medical research, but they've also supplied a bevy of medically important plants, animals, and medicines with almost no return in most cases because we will take these things, patent them in this country, and they receive no return for them. So I think that the debt is ours to fulfill, that we owe them better medical care because they have been so key to our being able to devise and test so many medicines. They've undertaken the risk that, frankly, we haven't asked Americans to undertake.
So you described in your comments just now and throughout the book sort of a different moral universe than the one we have now in biomedical enterprise. And so that leads to one of the questions I received from one of our participants. And the question is, have you found effective ways for yourself and others to contest these practices? The frame of the 99% seemed to appeal to a lot of people who are starting to get angry about corporate power. Have you thought at all about how we might use this climate to expand people's thinking about corporate power as about banks to biotech?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And the answer is yes, I've thought about it. I can't come up with any answers yet, but I do have a couple ideas for approaches. And one of the things that really troubles me is I realized the reason why I was having a very hard time trying to come up with material things that people can do, that I can do to change situations, is because, in my opinion, a lot of the laws that are passed that shield these practices are passed because of lobbying. The pharmaceutical industry, for example, hires a huge number of lobbyists, and they talk to lawmakers, people in the Congress and House of Representatives, who pass laws that are in line with the corporate agenda, but they don't. These are the same laws that work against us. To take just one example, the laws against reimportation. Why can't people who cannot afford their medications in this country, why can't they buy the same medication from Canada? We're told, well, it wouldn't be safe. They haven't been tested here. We don't know if they're good enough. But sometimes medications are made in the same factory. They're made by the same company. I don't think that's a legitimate argument. I think what's happening is that laws against reimportation prevent corporations from losing money they could make by selling them to people here. So the bottom line is we have some constraints on what we're able to do until we get rid of these lobbyists. Getting rid of the lobbies, I think, would be probably the single most important thing that would happen. And how everyday individual people can do that, all I can think of as a non-political person is I talk to your lawmaker, which I have done. Go to your lawmaker, make them aware of your concerns about this. Make them aware, and don't live alone. I always tell people when I'm speaking to groups, who should you do this with? Whoever you're already involved with. Go where you are. If you're active in your church and you put on health fairs, for example, make this one of your agenda items. Bring in experts to talk about it with you. And then together, draft letters to your lawmakers, your local lawmakers. Bring it up at your church synod. If you're active in your sorority or fraternity, bring it up there. Whatever group you're involved with, try to get a groundswell of like-minded people and approach your legislator and let them know these issues of deep concern to you, and let them know that you're looking for them to suggest laws and support laws in line with your concerns. When this was done in California, it actually bore some fruit. Xavier Becerra, I think, partnered with Dave Weldon from another state and proposed bills against gene patenting. In this, we had someone in New York State, also Patrick Leahy, who listened to his constituents and also proposed a bill against gene patenting. If people in every state were to do this, we might see some actions. I think that's one thing that we can definitely do. That would be really important. The other thing is that periodically there are court cases that come up. You read about them in the newspaper. Almost always when a person goes up against a corporation, as I said before, seeking to regain control over tissues from their bodies that have been taken, or seeking to protest a gene patent that is, always lose. There are all these amicus curiae briefs, all these friend of the courts briefs held by other researchers and corporations who share the same interest. But the courts don't often hear from everyday people. I think everyday people feel that, it wouldn't be helpful. So I always urge people, you read about these things that concern you, write a few lines to the court, write a few lines to your lawmakers. I think that's probably our best bet of seeing some things change. Not everything, probably, but if we can even make a few changes, I think that might send some messages to the people in Congress who are listening to lobbyists rather than their constituents.
In the book, you use stories not only of people and patients and researchers who've been harmed or constrained by sort of corporate-driven practices, but you also talk about people who've sort of found very effective strategies to counter those practices. Do you think any of those could be leveraged for wider use?
One of the things, and this does not apply to everybody, this only certain people are able to do this, people who have either been blessed or, cursed by possession of an unusual gene. But some of them have been very successful in turning the fact that they have, for example, are a hemophiliac, who happens to have, as a result of his hemophilia, a blood component that's very, very valuable. Ted Slavin was that person. His doctor told him that, you have blood components that's very, very valuable. You should know that. And he acted on that knowledge. He actually began selling his blood to corporations. He devised a company, Essential Biologicals, to do that. He recruited other people, other hemophiliacs, and other people who had unusual blood, and they banded together. And I thought that was a wonderful model because what Ted Slavin did, what I think was so important, was he not only sold his blood to corporations, he gave it away to researchers who didn't have the money for it, but who were engaged in research that he believed in. And I thought that was really important. I also saw this in the parents of children who had the PXE gene that created a devastating illness in them. They actually, these were two people who knew nothing about medicine. They were not medical people at all. But when they realized that the avarice of some researchers was, in their opinion, studying research for the gene that could help their children, they took matters into their own hands. And they actually were able to, they worked with a researcher, and they told the researcher, we will give you everything we want, just as the Canavans people did. We'll give you the blood and tissue samples, but in exchange, we want to be co-holders of the patent on this gene. That was brilliant. So now they have a say in how the patent is used. So that kind of innovation, I think, is really, really important, and I find it really interesting that it's some very often lay people who did it. But there are also researchers who are engaged in innovation, and the interesting thing about the researchers' innovation is that it often harkens back to before 1980. The researchers looking into prostate cancer, and to do that, they have partnered together, which has become a no-no in corporate research because of patent issues. Corporations don't like their researchers broadcasting certain information or partnering with people because there can be a question as to who has control of the patent. Well, these researchers have decided that's not important. What was important was finding better treatments for prostate cancer, and they banded it together to do that. There's also, of course, foundations like the Gates Foundation and Gavi and all these groups who are dedicated to improving the world's health who have sort of dispensed with this patent model or modified it in such a way that it's no longer dictating treatment. So I see lots of hope. I see foundations who are, like the Gates Foundation has engineered lots of partnerships between different advocacy groups, nonprofit groups, and pharmaceutical companies. That's really important, involving the pharmaceutical company in a different model that's not strictly based on, patent protection. So I see a lot of hope.
Could you talk about some of the challenges you faced while researching the book, and then maybe some of the responses you've had once the book was published? I mean, you've worked as an insider in science, and yet you take on scientific orthodoxy.
Yes, I do. Well, my experiences are varied. The nice experiences are, and sometimes surprisingly, how open some people are. I mean, even knowing that the point that I'm making or the question I'm engaging in might be critical of an institution or them or put them in a bad light, there are those groups in universities who are still very open in discussing what's happened, and that's very nice. Then there are people who, I think one of the more difficult things I come up against is that I don't subscribe to this mantle of objectivity. Objectivity would be wonderful if any of us were capable of it. I don't think it's really a reasonable objective, but I think it's something one should always aim for. But I think it's almost hubris to say that you've achieved it. I pretty quickly, in the course of my education and work history, I already had an opinion. Although I have to caution and say it wasn't a hard opinion. I have been surprised by some things I've learned. But I already had an opinion. I think it's incredibly important to be fair. And one of the problems I run into is it's hard to be fair to an organization that won't talk to you. It really is. I think that I don't like, in general, binary descriptions, because one of the things that I say repeatedly during my book, I certainly don't shy away from discussing the failures and the abuses perpetuated by pharmaceutical companies, but they also sometimes have been capable of great altruism. And so I always think that, well, if they're doing this, if they're actually giving medications to people who can't afford them, if they're actually subsuming their desire for a patent to a common need, then we have to acknowledge that. We have to praise them in doing that. We want them to do more of that, right? So, but the problem is sometimes these companies who do sometimes show altruistic behavior still are not willing to talk to you because I don't know, you'd have to ask them why. But for whatever reason, they're not really open to talking to me. And so then it's sort of left for me to piece together what's going on, either from talking to whatever advocates of theirs, I can talk to, or gleaning from their writings and speeches, what their opinion is. Very often they post position statements, so it doesn't make it that hard to know their position, to know their thinking on the topic. But it does really make it hard to get a specific reaction, to a pointed question sometimes. And I think that's one thing that's missing from the book that I would have liked to be able to do more of, but I can only do that if people are willing to hold a conversation. So that's a big challenge. The other challenge is that although, as I said, I don't believe people or groups tend to be 100% bad or 100% good. I try to avoid that binary thinking. I think that's kind of a rare quality. I think lots of people like binary thinking and are more comfortable in seeing something as all good or all bad. Certainly, I criticize the pharmaceutical industry as being mostly disappointing. I mean, their behavior to the American people and to the people in the developing world, I actually find shockingly, amoral sometimes. That doesn't mean they can't change, and that doesn't mean, things can't be changed. But I also think sometimes it's a little difficult to say that because the same quality that makes the industry representatives sometimes don't want to talk to me at all disappoints people who would expect me to say that these are evil people who should be burned at the stake and dispensed with. Well, we can't dispense with the industry. We need it. Someone's got to make the medicine. What we can do is try our best to encourage them to devise these medicines in a different way with a much greater respect and concern for people's autonomy and well-being. So I think those are the challenges, sort of trying to avoid the binary trap and trying to talk to people who don't want to talk to me are probably the things I remember as being the most frustrating goals.
And then a follow-up question from one of our participants. Could you talk about the responses to your book and to the points you've been making? What kinds of responses do you get when you do book talks, interviews, write short articles based on your research? Have you heard from the biotech industry, and have media outlets been open?
Yes. Well, many people in the biotech industry can't, I'm an idiot and probably amoral. I mean, they're just not at all pleased, and that's not surprising. I mean, I'm very critical of their industry, so I can't expect them to be pleased. I find some of their responses a little, I don't even want to say amusing, because I'm not really amused, but interesting in that I would expect that if they, think my work is deeply flawed, but actually some of their responses show a lack of understanding, a lack of sophistication. Almost insulted a little bit, because I'm thinking, don't they understand that I know that and I've actually addressed that? But the fact is they're very defensive, and that's, again, understandable. I think that I'm trying to think of the substantive response that I've had. I think that, there are things like, I've heard that I don't understand the nature of a patent, for example, and that what I'm considering a monopoly is not really a monopoly for some technical legal reason. A lawyer wrote that, and if he told me that what I'm describing as being a monopoly is not a monopoly in a legal sense, I'm not in a position to question that. He knows the law and I don't. I do know that 99.9% of English speakers define monopoly in just the way that I do. So I don't think that it's, for that reason, I don't think there's anything deceptive or erroneous about my work. And frankly, that's the quality of law response that I've gotten. I hear people raise some arcane point of the law that, for all I know, sometimes may or may not be true. They don't affect my message, and they don't affect what I said, because there's a lot of semantic wrangling going on. And when semantic wrangling descends into legal terminology, I'm always reminded of what James Coonan wrote. He wrote, "There is no greater illustration of the ability of an adjective to modify a noun than the use of the word legal before the word ethics." So I'm sort of daily reminded of that. Now, in the medical and scientific responses, I fare a bit better because I certainly do understand what they're saying, and I certainly do understand that the same thing very often is going on. There's often some semantic wrangling among finer points that either, frankly, I haven't yet seen a case in which I think I'm wrong. I think either I'm correct, but more to the point, the thing that bothers me is not so much that I'm correct, but it's the fact that it's taking place at a level so removed from the level of the lay people for whom the book was written. I didn't write the book for legal experts. I didn't write the book for medical experts, although I worked very hard and was fortunate to be advised by experts in the field to make sure that it was accurate in those fields. But that's not who I wrote it for. It's not meant to be a dialogue among experts in patent law. I certainly am, and I'm just not capable of that. But I am capable of looking at what's being done with that law and the effects on people's lives and the ethics stature of it. So that's sort of like the conversation that I'm having. But usually, unfortunately, these are not people who usually speak up when I do speak at biological industries, companies. I've spoken at Boehringer Ingelheim. I spoke at DTC, which is a medical marketing group, a few weeks ago. And I tend not to get questions. I tend not to get any pointed questions. The things that I'm reading as criticism are usually things that pop up on blogs, for example. And as I say, I often find them to be sort of beside the point or inaccurate. They reflect a how can I say it? They reflect an incomplete understanding of what I have written, and I think maybe that's sometimes intentional. The common cry of a writer who's been critiqued.
I'm going to pick up on a point you made. You talk about sort of the semantic play and manipulation that goes on among lawyers, especially within the world of patent law. And throughout the book, you're critical of sort of the force that laws like the Bayh-Dole Act have had. And yet, sort of in your last chapter, you call largely upon law to affect the changes that you hope to see. So why do you have so much faith in the law?
Well, because the law is variegated. You have people in the law who I think are people like some, I hasten to say not all, of the patent lawyers who criticize me. I mean, sometimes people are sort of completely focused on their goal of, supporting a money-making scheme, and they're not really looking at the wider issues. But then you also have lawyers, like people I met at the Harvard School of Public Health, fiercely dedicated to protecting the welfare of people in the developing world. So you've got a mixture of people, and I think that we have a critical mass of legal experts who do care about making sure that the distribution of health care is as equitable as we can make it. I've met a lot of them. I know they're out there. I know these people exist, as well as the people who are not so focused on that. And that's why I have faith in the system. I also have faith in the system. If you notice, when I talk about pursuing the law, I'm talking also about everyday people pursuing these goals through the law. So I think that that's going to be the critical piece. When you have lay people who see the problem from the ground level, who are being affected by the problem from the ground level, who can't get health care, can't buy their medication, or who have relatives still in the developing world who are dying simply because of these patent schemes, then you have these people adding an impetus to lawyers, and I think we're going to see change. At least I hope so.
We have another question from a participant. Is there any systematic quantitative research in how gene patents affect access to medicines, and what does that show?
There's probably quite a bit, not all of which I know of. I do know that if you look at the document supporting the current case against Myriad, and I think 9 of its patents, BRCA1 and BRCA2 patents, you're going to find a wealth of research there that substantiates the arguments of not only the plaintiffs who are lay people, but you have many of these plaintiffs who are geneticists. So they themselves, have expertise in the area, and they themselves critique these practices and think that they should be rolled back.
I'm going to preempt everybody else and take the last question. Who do you see as your intellectual and political allies in this broader conversation that you're sort of launching or initiating? So, for example, you discussed Vandana Shiva's work against agribusiness. Who else would you include in that circle?
I'm terribly sorry. I didn't hear the last thing. The name of the group?
Oh, so you, in the book, for example, you refer to the work done by Vandana Shiva and her challenge to agribusiness. And it certainly seems like, in a sense, you're participating in conversation with her. I know you said your goal is to sort of reach everybody, the lay people as well, but who else would you have us read and listen to?
There are so many. Vandana Shiva is certainly very important, and I would be, very grateful to be considered an ally of hers. But there are also people like James Love, who specifically questions the deployment of patents in the developing world, even as we refuse to recognize our own intellectual property and what that means. There are people in this country like, people in Canada like Richard Gold, who published a really important report showing some of the similarities of how how our current structure affects people in the developing world and people in the Western world alike. Then the Gates Foundation, of course, and Gavi and the UN Foundation, all these nonprofit groups who are trying to build alliances between advocates for people who need medicines and pharmaceutical companies. Those, I think, I especially admire, because I think that's going to be the future. If this problem is going to be solved, it's going to be solved by a confederation of people who think like me and people who understand the importance of getting the pharmaceutical industry over to our way of thinking. And let's see, I'm sure there's something that might be very important I'm forgetting. Sheldon Krinsky, I read his work early on, and it was extremely influential.
All right, I'm going to give you one last question from our participant. It's a good one. You've been interviewed a lot in the media about this book and about medical apartheid. Do you think other science writers and other reporters are getting it?
That's a good question. And again, I'm not fond of binary thought, so I shy away from saying whether they are or not getting it. I will say that I think a lot may not be getting it because there's sometimes a tendency among science writers, I stress sometimes, I don't want to hear from all of them, but I stress that sometimes there's a tendency to shy away from criticizing the scientific industry, and there are various reasons for that. I think that, unfortunately, a wholehearted support of things done in the name of science is sometimes seductive to those science journalists who may not be terribly well equipped to analyze for themselves reports and writings. There are a lot of them, just as there are a lot of science writers who are equipped to do that. But those, I think, find it much safer and much more comfortable to sort of blindly support the scientific orthodoxy, which would certainly, lessen their tendency to support me because I'm so critical of that orthodoxy. And then, of course, you have the very adept scientific writers and journalists who, might go either way. But I do think that it's difficult sometimes, even for science journalists, to see beyond the pharmaceutical industry's extremely pervasive control of the dialogue on any of these things. One of the things I hear very, very frequently from science journalists is, but pharmaceutical industries spend all this money researching drugs. They spend $8 million a year. They spend $2 billion a year. It's simply not true. That report has been roundly debunked by a slew of people, from Errol Guzner, on down, the public citizen. It's simply not true, and yet they believe this. And I don't think it means they're credulous. I think it means the industry has done such a great job of disseminating its own, worldview that sometimes it's, it requires an education, I think, even to, to evaluate the claims and the stance of people like me. So
Thank you. I think we're at time. I'm getting a red flag, so I want to thank Harriet Washington very much again for participating in this conversation. We've been talking about her book, Deadly Monopolies, The Shocking Corporate Takeover of Life Itself and the Consequences for Your Health and Our Medical Future. Now I'm going to turn it over to Marcy. Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I just want to add my thanks to Harriet for sharing all this important work, to Lisa for a wonderful conversation, to everyone on the line for your great questions and for being part of this Talking Biopolitics event. And a couple of reminders, we'll be sending you a follow-up email with all this information, but if you want to find out more about the Tarrytown Meetings, you can contact us or search Tarrytown Meetings on the CGS website. And we are going to be posting recordings of this Talking Biopolitics conversation and the previous ones on YouTube and on the CGS website. We'll put all that in an email to all of you. We'd really welcome your feedback on this event and the Talking Biopolitics series in general. So thanks, everybody, again. Bye-bye for now.